You all can spread out a little bit. Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Please silence your phones, and when we're ready for questions, please come over to the podium, state your name and your outlet, and we are asking in the interest of time to limit to one question so that everyone can ask one. Joining us today, we have Chief James E. White, Assistant Chief David LaValle, Office of Professional Development, Assistant Chief Charles Fitzgerald, Office of Enforcement Operations, Assistant Chief Eric Ewing, Office of Field Support, Deputy Chief Carrie Sloan, Detective Bureau, Commander Michael McGinnis of Professional Standards, Internal Affairs, Director Nazneen Mia, Office of Professional Development, Executive Manager Mary Engelman of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. We also have a few members of our Board of Police Commissioners. We have Commissioner Reverend Jim Holly, Vice Chair, Commissioner Linda Bernard, and Commissioner Annie Holt.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for making time to be here. I'm here to provide a community update regarding a lawsuit filed last week involving facial recognition. This obviously remains a very controversial topic, but my commitment to transparency required that I address the issues that have come up in this past week head on, and that's why we are here today. I have my staff with me that have assisted in a variety of different ways of looking at the circumstances involved in the lawsuit and some of the things that we've concluded. Assistant Chief LaValle will be speaking to some of the policy revisions that we're going to talk about, and I have Commander McGinnis, who is over our professional standards, who will be launching an internal investigation. There have been many reports that the individual arrested was because of misidentification and facial recognition, and that is factually incorrect. That is not the case. However, what is true is that the arrest emanated from, candidly and unfortunately, a poor investigation. I'll get into that in a moment. The arrest was a result of a violation of our eyewitness identification and lineup policy. The arrest happened after that violation occurred, which resulted in a misleading lineup and a misleading photo lineup. Again, we'll get into that in a moment. The policy changes that I'm recommending to the Board of Police Commissioners today, that hopefully they will be able to take up very soon, will ensure that something like this will never happen again. I'll set some context for you and explain what exactly occurred. On January 29th, 2023, an individual picked up an unknown female in the area of East 7 Mile in Hoover. He then drove to the area of Gratiot and Bessemer. After arriving at Gratiot and Bessemer, the unknown female exited the vehicle and got into a black Tahoe. A male subsequently exited that Tahoe and produced a handgun and carjacked the individual. Now, this suspect, the female, had spent some time with the driver of that vehicle and that victim who was carjacked. At this point, the suspect who exited the Tahoe carjacked the vehicle, taking the vehicle and the victim's car phone or cell phone. The phone was later tracked down to a BP gas station located at 6420 Van Dyke. An investigator from DPD responded to that location, reviewed the gas station's video, and observed the individual who had left the phone. So to further explain that, after the victim was carjacked, his vehicle was taken as well as his phone, he contacted a family member who then proceeded to continuously call his phone to see if they could get someone to answer it. And in fact, they did do that. And when they answered it, it was determined that that was an employee at that BP gas station. He informed that employee that his brother had been carjacked, and at which time, and I just identified who he was, at which time the brother said, you know, my brother was a victim of carjacking, and the officer arrived there, pulls the photo, looks at the video, and proceeds to do the investigation. An image of the individual identified who dropped the phone or who left the phone there. They used that photo for facial recognition. The photo lineup from the facial recognition was created. The carjacking victim identified the image of the person as Miss Woodruff as the perpetrator. And again, just to give you a little more background, the image of this female, which dropped the phone, was submitted in accordance with our policy with facial recognition because it was one of those violent felonies. The technology yielded an investigative lead, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. In fact, in this instance, it produced 73 possibilities of who the suspect was. Now, the human interaction from that requires that lead is exhausted. You then go into the investigation, you do a number of things to ensure that the investigative lead is possibly your suspect. It's the launch of the investigative point. It does not appear that that occurred. The lead was turned over to the investigator, which should have launched that investigation. That image was peer reviewed, which is required by policy, again, supporting the fact that the facial recognition policy was followed. However, and unfortunately, at that point, a photo lineup was presented to the victim. And I know this is complex, but I want to make sure that I hit every key point. A photo lineup was presented to the victim of the carjacking, which included Ms. Woodruff. The problem with that is you cannot use a photo lineup inclusive of a facial recognition photo in a lineup. Cannot happen. The reason for that is facial recognition is picking up measurements on a face, identifying who this could be. And if you put that into a photo lineup, essentially what you're doing is identifying the most likely person who looks like the victim. That cannot happen. Our policy prohibits that from happening. The victim's act of identifying Ms. Woodruff as the perpetrator served as the basis for the warrant submission. The warrant was subsequently signed and Ms. Woodruff was arrested. It was later learned that Ms. Woodruff was not the perpetrator. Now, the one thing that we did do correctly in this matter is we acted quickly. The investigator then goes to the DDC, recognizes that our perpetrator is 8 months pregnant, asks for her immediate release because the suspect in this instance was not pregnant. And so that should have been picked up as well. I have no reason to conclude at this time that there has been any violations of the DPD facial recognition policy. However, I have determined that there's been a number of policy violations by the lead investigator in this case. DPD policies clearly state that members are to avoid the use of photos that so closely resemble the suspect that a person familiar with the suspect might find it difficult to distinguish the suspect from other individuals presented in the lineup. And the reason for that is if you use a facial recognition photo, if you were to put my photo in photo recognition, it's not just going to produce my photo, it's going to produce a number of people who could possibly be me. And if you were to then take that photo and put it into a lineup, as I indicated earlier, then it is possible to taint the photo lineup by presenting a person who looks most like the suspect. It's a counterintuitive process. You wouldn't do that. It doesn't make sense, and it's improper, and it's not going to happen again. In other words, you don't want to put the suspect's twin in a lineup, right? Because if you don't know the person, you're going to pick them out. What gave some validation to the false identification of Ms. Woodruff was the fact that the suspect, the victim had spent some time with the suspect. So it wasn't like it was a robbery where the person walked up, robbed them, they glanced at him and left. They were actually in that vehicle a considerable amount of time, spending some time together before the carjacking happened. So, one bad act of not doing a thorough investigation, second bad act of showing a photo and that was similar to the suspect led the victim in this case to say, yep, that's the person. And then, of course, the prosecutor signs the warrant and we make the arrest. Normally, any identification from a photo lineup is not deemed conclusive by investigators or prosecutors, but the victim or witness normally only gets a brief look, as I indicated, of the perpetrator during the crime photo ID and should only be treated as a lead. From there, investigators follow up to see if there is other evidence incriminating the individual who was identified. We have talked about that ad nauseum. That is our policy. It must be followed each and every time. In this case, it was not. This would be no different if we took a mug book, a paper mug book like the old days, and took a picture out and went out and said, is this the person? And you said yes, and we arrested him. That would be improper. The same is true here. That is the beginning of the investigation. And in 2023, there's enough technology beyond facial recognition to determine if a person was near the crime scene, such as phone dumps. I can determine with phone towers, everyone's got a phone in their pocket. Were you near there? Were you at work? I can check and pull phone or work records to see if you were in fact at work. None of those things occurred. They have to occur in this instance. From there, investigators follow up, as I indicated, to see if any other incriminating or individuals were identified. Incriminating evidence or other individuals. Something as simple as if it's a robbery and the person was not, is the person associated with the victim? Those types of things. This case was unusual, as I indicated, because the suspect and the victim had spent some time together. When the victim conclusively identified the suspect from the photo lineup, that was given great weight by the investigators and the prosecutors because of the extensive time that the suspect and the victim had spent together. In this case, one of the photos in the photo lineup had been generated by the facial recognition system. In retrospect, it seems clear that while the victim's ID seemed conclusive, the victim had identified what equated to a lookalike. And I have looked at those photos myself, and very clearly, they look alike. They look alike. And that's why the work starts. It doesn't stop, it starts. Photo lineups are IDs that should be treated cautiously in the best of circumstances. And just to put that in a little further context for you, 27 years of doing this work before facial recognition, photo lineups, it's the same thing. It's even when, not saying it's the same as facial recognition, what I'm saying, it's the same requirement on the investigation. A mug book, pulling out a person's photo, that's a very powerful tool, and you must treat it cautiously. So, effective immediately, I have issued an order changing the department's photo ID lineup policy so that this cannot happen again. I'm instituting 3 reforms immediately, and I'm looking forward to the BOPC's review of the policy and approval going forward. First, no member will be allowed to use facial recognition derived images in a photographic lineup, period. You cannot put a facial recognition photo in a photo lineup because it's going to generate, at the least, a lookalike. Second, all photo lineups will be conducted using a sequential double-blind presentation to the victim. I will try to explain a sequential double-blind presentation without getting too lost in the weeds and police talk. Essentially, as we've seen on TV, there is 6 people who line up, and those are called live lineups, where you look at 6 people. Is that the person who harmed you? Number 3, number 4, number 5 is that person, whatever number it may be. On a photo lineup, what the department policy will change to, instead of putting 6 people at one time on a piece of paper and showing it to you, what we will do is put 6 photos in an envelope. We will take the first envelope, hand it to you, you pull the photo out, and we will say, is that him or her? It will be yes or no, and we will do that 6 times in 6 individualized envelopes. The next key important change to our policy will be this. It will be called it's called a double blind draw, meaning that I'm the investigator who knows who the suspect is. I know who the suspect is. So I will not participate in the lineup. However, an uninvolved detective who does not know who the suspect is will take those 6 photos and they will do the sequential draw and provide it to the victim to identify one of the photos if in fact that photo is there. And that is just an added layer of insulation so that there is no bias, there is no predetermined information, that you don't know which one of the 6 photos are the suspect. You then come back to the original investigator and say, our victim picked number 3, The photos will be numbered, the envelopes will be numbered. Now the detective, who is aware of who the victim is and who the suspect is, opens the envelope and sees that 3 is either the suspect or is not the suspect. I know that that was a bit wordy, but I think it was necessary to explain it. I'm sure questions will come up about that. And then finally, prior to conducting a photographic lineup, a supervisor is to ensure that there is independent basis for believing that the suspect who is pictured in the photo lineup or in the sequential draw has the means, ability, and opportunity to commit the crime. In other words, you're not, 8 months pregnant, or you're not out of state during the time the crime had been committed. Not suggesting that someone who's pregnant can't commit a crime, but in this instance, there was no identificator or identifiers that indicated that our suspect was in fact 8 months pregnant. So that's where we are. I would like to bring Assistant Chief LaValle up just to hit some very high-level highlights at this time, and we will take any questions. AC LaValle.
All right, thank you. So Assistant Chief David LaValle, I oversee the Office of Professional Development. Part of those duties include policy development, policy updates, civil rights auditing. I can tell you, as a result of what is occurring right now, we did do a review of all of our facial arrests that have occurred in the last year and a half. In all of those cases, except for the case that we're referring to today, there was independent evidence outside of the facial rec photograph that led the officers to believe there was enough probable cause for arrest. But one of the things that we're going to put in place is a policy update on our facial recognition policy to strengthen our review or our audits of those arrests. And so what that is every time an officer or an investigator believes that they have enough information to make an arrest where there was a facial recognition photograph involved or identification involved, before they can make the arrest or before they can submit a warrant to the prosecutor, we're putting in place a 2-part review, much like the review that we had in place for identifying a photograph through facial recognition. The peer review at that point, we're putting in a supervisory peer review for a request to make an arrest or a request to submit a warrant to the prosecutor. So, like the chief mentioned, the investigators go out, they develop their probable cause independent of the photograph and independent of the name that they received. When they're ready to make the arrest, they have to go to their commanding officer, so it'll be the captain of either the precinct or the investigative unit that's responsible for conducting the investigation, present their case. That captain would then sign off on the fact that they believe there's enough independent probable cause. Then it's reviewed a second time by the captain that's in charge of our investigative operations division. They sign off, and so once they have those 2 independent captain level reviews, they can then submit a warrant to the prosecutor. So that's going to be a recommendation that we're making to the Board of Police Commissioners, which will strengthen the review before we make an arrest, before we take anybody into custody where there was facial recognition involved in the case. I think that the other policy reviews or policy updates the chief already pretty much covered with regard to our photo identifications and how we conduct those lineups or those sequential double-blind draw reviews. So those are going to be 2 major policy updates that we're going to present to the board, which we believe will strengthen the policy and the use of facial recognition to ensure that we don't take anybody into custody that we don't have enough probable cause to believe that they committed the crime.
Thank you.
Yep.
And before I take any questions, we've got professional standards here. We've got our diversity, equity, and inclusion team lead, and certainly we have our Civil Rights Integrity Bureau Director, Naz, in this line. We're all looking at this, and we take this very seriously, and we want to ensure, that nothing like this ever happens again, particularly, it's particularly difficult when you're talking to someone who or talking about someone who is 8 months pregnant. So we empathize with that. We recognize, we have to do better, and there will be accountability on this mistake. But the misinformation is that this was a fraudulent facial recognition discovery. That is just incorrect. What this is very, very poor investigative work that led to a number of inappropriate decisions being made along the lines of the investigation. And that's something that this team is committed to not only correcting, having accountability, having transparency with this community, and then building policy immediately to ensure, regardless of the tool being used, this never happens. I don't care if it's the wrong ticket being written. We must do better, and we will. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Hi, Chief. Mara McDonald from DIV. I'm trying to, from what you've said, this isn't, in your view, a technology problem. It's a human error problem with, operator error. Can you explain so the person who is not an investigator can understand? They put that photo or that video, that still of that photo in the facial recognition. You said they got something like 73 hits. How do they narrow down those 73 hits to 4 or 5 that look promising? And then what should this investigator had done? Should he have not showed those pictures, number one, to that victim? And should he have, or she, have somehow weeded out? I guess I don't understand what the extra steps should have been to ensure that you have the right person in the right picture.
So we have, yes, and I like the way you added 3 questions to one. Very good job.
I'm by myself today. I figured I could get away with it.
So what happened in this instance, starting with the first part of your question, the 73. So whenever you use, and because we're talking about facial rec, let's talk about facial rec for 1 second with regards to what it produces. So any person in this room, if your photo is ran through facial rec, and Detroit police are not the only agency that's using facial rec, as we know, MSP has it, it's all over the state and various agencies, it's in private sector, casinos, it's at airports. So what happens is you put a picture in, okay, and it produces a number of people. It doesn't say, this is James White. It says, this is 50 to 70 to 80 opportunities to be James White based on an algorithm and my face, my measurements, my jaw, my eyes, those types of things. It produces those numbers, and it says, this could be James White, one of 20 pictures, one of 100 pictures. Included in that are people of different gender, different race. So if James White is a black male, which I am, you go in and you say, okay, remove all of the females out. Okay, so now from that, let's say we've got 100 possibilities. There's 50 females, you take 50 out. Now there's 50 left. And in that, you say, okay, now of the 50 that are left, 25 of these people are white, okay, and James White's a black male. So you take those 25 out. Now you're left with 25. And of the 25, what the detectives have to do is say, okay, of these 25, looking at you turn them over to an analyst, there's a peer review, and you say, I think 10 of these people could possibly be James White. The analyst then on a peer review takes it, looks at it and says, okay, I feel that 5 of them could possibly be, but if you think it's 10, okay, let's take a look at them. And then what you do is you investigate to see, what the crime is, and if those 10 people had the opportunity to do it. Meaning, if the 10 people, you have to look at every single one. It happened, you have to make sure that they're capable, right? Are they in the hospital? Are they handicapped? Could they, if the person ran away? I mean, it's so many different layers. Okay, and so now you arrive at a certain number. After you scrub all of that, let's say that number goes down to 5. Okay, now you then start to investigate those 5 for opportunity. You do everything you need to do. You see if there's any connection between the victim and the suspect, if it's a violent crime, if it's an assault, if it's a shooting, if the victim told you I was arguing with someone at a party, you see if that other of those 5 who was at the party. What you don't do, and you will not do, is take that photo, plug it into a lineup, and then say to the victim, is that him? Because if you don't know me, it's measured, it's going to identify the likely possibility that it is. And that's the part that's improper. So what the detective should have done is not that, A, and B, detective work, investigative work to ensure that the suspects that we've identified were there.
So they went from 0 to 60.
That's exactly, unfortunately, the case. But again, I think the characterization that, quote, facial recognition produced the wrong identifier is improper. What is proper is that the investigator did shoddy investigative work.
Thank you for explaining to the non-investigator. I get it now.
Hi, Kelly Vaughn, CBS Detroit. I want to make sure I understand this. Was there a policy in place where they were not allowed to use facial recognition photos in photo lineups before? Or was that just discouraged and now it's an actual policy? Or what's the exact policy change?
So the exact policy change speaks to a number of things. A, that there's a strict prohibition on using a facial recognition photo in a photo lineup, okay? Was it expressly articulated in policy? There is room for interpretation that we've completely eliminated, but it should be understood in this work that that is literally perhaps one of the most counterintuitive things you could do, because it's going to already produce lookalikes. And the idea of a lineup is not to do lookalikes, it's to get people who are familiar. You know, if it's a light-complected person with a beard, then you would choose light-complected with beard, but you wouldn't scientifically choose people for a photo lineup, because that would not be consistent with trying to identify the suspect. And by the way, even in doing that, which is improper to ever use a facial recognition photo in a lineup, but even in doing that, work still needed to occur. That did not occur in this case.
And if you don't mind, would you mind explaining where these photos are coming from when you're like searching in the database? Are they just mugshots or from being on a sidewalk? Where do the photos come from?
Mugshots primarily, driver's license photos. Yep, state of Michigan driver's license photos, ID cards, and mugshots.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone.